I'd sure love to, hear what did it feel like when you won the awards for DEI in Charity Village's inaugural conference and awards.
Yeah, so I mean, it was an affirming experience. I mean, we're an organization that focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the work that we do, right? So it's one of the things that's actually important to us. That's part of our strategic plan is to walk the talk, or move the communication if we want to be as inclusive as possible, and really, follow in the footsteps of what we encourage others to do, which, as a small nonprofit that historically until recently didn't have much of a staff team, it's certainly been also still a journey for us in terms of getting those policies and procedures and everything together. But our internal chat when we won just blew up with people being excited and really affirmed by the fact that we were honored in such a way.
Well, that's wonderful. I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk about your organization and your programs internally and what you think really made the difference for you that allowed you to gain this recognition and win the award.
Travail Canada is a national member services nonprofit. So we're different than a number of the other nonprofits in that we do operate under this member services model, but our members are organizations, large employers. And then we also provide other additional programming for the community. And so all of our programming is focused around making sure that workplaces are inclusive of two-spirit, queer, and trans communities, and really trying to create space for that conversation, both in the education that we do through webinars, member workshops, roundtable discussions, public panels, and more, as well as trying to connect people through networking events like Rendezvous, which is for women and non-binary folks, Matrices, which is for trans, non-binary, and agender job seekers and professionals, which there isn't really many spaces for us to connect, as well as things like Brain Date, which is open to all of our employees at our membership. But I think the thing that really kind of moved the bar for us in terms of that the award was the fact that we've gone through a lot of changes in the last year. Back in December 2020, we had a staff team of 4 full-timers and 1 part-timer. And now we have a full-time staff team of 9 and 2 part-timers. And so over that period, we've been going through some major organizational change. And we really, instead of just kind of said, okay, let's go, do more, we really said to ourselves, like, let's work on our internal culture, make sure that all of our members of our team feel like they have all the things that they need, so that we can actually move forward. So that included things like doing all staff mental health first aid training. It included providing additional supports to folks like myself who I went from having no direct reports to having 5. So that's been quite the shift. So I got some help in regards to how do you organize your team in the most inclusive way as possible, and looked for some outside support in that regard. But we also have been just working on other pieces. So making sure that our orientation package is as inclusive as possible, making sure that we have our employee handbook, that our benefits are inclusive. And for example, we're one of the few nonprofits we know, especially small nonprofits, where we pay the employee portion of benefits. So the employee isn't even paying that additional piece out of their income. So we really tried to create as many of these spaces for training, connection, and building together in a virtual environment, because over the pandemic, we did see our team grow, and that included, we now have somebody in Nanaimo, BC. We have somebody in just outside of Halifax. We have our staff member in Montreal, as well as the majority of our team within the GTA, but not all of which who come into the office. So we've really been trying to create that environment on a virtual basis so that even the employees who don't come into the office still have that connection and that experience, and that virtual environment is the one that we prioritize. And so we've been creating all these different spaces for people to give feedback and engagement, and really just listening to what the members of the team need, and providing space for that. I sometimes think we focus a bit too much on what is the immediate crisis, and we those of us in nonprofits, we have the tendency to do that. But I really believe that taking a step back, making sure that you have space for your time, for your team to build and connect together, is a really big piece of that. For instance, my team, the programs team, every Monday we meet up, but we don't just talk about what's going on that week. We also talk about how are people feeling? Does anybody need to convey anything? And then we also spend half the meeting thinking of big picture issues, like how do we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion in the work that we do, but also internally. And so it's really making that space that I think, led to that award.
Well, as you probably imagine, once the awards were announced, a whole lot of people in the sector were asking, well, what did they do? And really wanted to give you an opportunity to provide some advice to organizations who may want to emulate your work,
Mm.
and to try and bring some of that learning that you've gone through yourself into their own organizations.
I would say start with making sure that equity and diversity and inclusion isn't the afterthought. It's the before thought, and making sure that it's integrated every week that your team connects. You're always thinking about these things. I know a previous organization I worked for, we every meeting that we had a DEI activity to start our meeting, just so that our focus and our thoughts were there. I think it's also important to provide access for your employees to be able to give feedback about what they need. And, being in a management role, I know that although I've created a fairly welcoming environment for my team, at least I hope so, there's still things that you don't want to say to a supervisor. There is always things that even when you're in an inclusive environment, you might have hesitancy towards. And this is one thing that I've seen with members of my team is they have bad boss syndrome, which is that, they've had workplaces where they haven't cared as much about how inclusive they are. And sometimes employees will hold that over until they really have that sense of safety and trust, right? And so making sure that there is that space for employees to convey their needs and their wants and desires, to do their own professional development. I always want my employees thinking about what is their next opportunity. And ideally, that's with us and that they stay with us. But when you have that focus, your employee knows that you have a focus on them. Like we have a dedicated fund to every employee for professional development. And I've worked at a lot of nonprofits, so this is the first time I've ever had an explicit dedicated PD fund. And so giving your employees both that space to express themselves of what they need, as well as the space to develop, is really the secret sauce, as our friends over at Breakfast Culture, a DEI consulting company, would say. Really having that focus. And then the other piece, which is something that's an ongoing process for us, is be honest about your shortcomings. Every organization has their shortcomings. Our organization does as well. And when you see those shortcomings, take action. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're creating action plans focused on a few key areas. So one is around accessibility, making sure that we are the most accessible that we can possibly be, which we know currently we're not, but we're on the road, but we have more work to do. And we have outside consultants helping us with that. Anti-Black racism. We know anti-Black racism is a major issue within Two-Spirit, queer, and trans communities that we need to address. Also reconciliation. and poverty reduction. We want to eventually become, although I think technically we already are, but not officially, a living wage employer. And when you invest in your staff, you invest in your organization's future in a way that I think we often lose sight of when we're running after funders, when we're running after the next project. And it's really taking those moments to step back and say, okay, what does my team need? What do they need both internally, but also what do they need to develop? And how can we look at the systemic issues of our organization? It's hard work, but it's worthwhile in the long run, and you see the progress in the long run.
Yeah, it's so important to that element of, well, you addressed it, employee engagement, retention, their own sort of vision for their own careers as being part of your focus, and finding the space where they feel safe in talking to management. That's a tough accomplishment. So congratulations. I did want to ask you in a more general sense, do you think these kinds of awards are good for the sector? And if so, why?
That's a tough question, actually. I mean, I think that they can be valuable, and there is a space for them. I think as a sector, we're historically not recognized enough. We're a lot of very passionate, very caring people. For the most part, I mean, that's why most of us are in this sector, right? Um, and so often our work and what we do is not recognized. And I mean, I know for things like appreciation, really it's that day to day recognition that is the most important thing. But sometimes those awards, they can mean that you take a step out, and you can also see that external to your organization, that what you're doing is being recognized, is being appreciated. And, um, that is something that is worthwhile. It's not going to be perfect for everyone. Not everybody is into an award ceremony. Not everybody needs that type of recognition. But it is something that for some people and some organizations, that can mean the difference between having attention and feeling recognized to doing the work in sometimes in a vacuum, and sometimes not in a way that others in your sector are seeing, right? And so I definitely think there's a place for them. I think that not everybody, however, it's the thing that's the most important. And I think if we start racing towards that being the way that we recognize people, then that loses quite a bit along the way. But if we see it as one tool within our broader toolbox of recognition, then it can add that additional piece. Sometimes you need a specific tool. You need a wrench. If you only have hammers, you're not going to be able to fix certain things, right? So that gives you that support.
Yeah, and I think too, it's so great as a way to build an expectation of best practices, and to, encourage and educate other organizations about the different things that they may not otherwise be aware of, that other organizations are actually doing in these areas. So thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to meet you, Jade.